The mansion rose like a fortress against the last smear of sunset, its marble walls glowing faintly gold, the tall glass windows reflecting the dying light. Inside, silence lingered where laughter and music had once poured from lavish parties. Now, only the ticking of an antique clock and the muted hum of the air conditioning disturbed the stillness. At precisely 7:14 p.m., the first frantic 911 call came through. "There's blood. Please, someone, he's not breathing." The voice was female, trembling, nearly collapsing into sobs. Dispatchers logged the address. A sprawling estate owned by Sheikh Rashid Al Karim, a billionaire businessman from Dubai who had relocated part of his empire to the United States. Minutes later, squad cars carved through the gated community, red and blue lights splashing against manicured lawns. Officers approached the vast iron gates, which swung open as if expecting them. What they found inside would set off a storm that no one could contain. The Sheikh lay sprawled across a Persian rug in the grand living room. His body, still adorned in a tailored silk shirt, bore the unmistakable pallor of death. A thin line of blood traced the corner of his mouth, staining his immaculate beard. Around him, the trappings of wealth, a crystal decanter, gold-framed portraits, an open cigar box, looked grotesquely ordinary beside the stillness of a corpse. Detective Harris, a seasoned investigator with graying temples and weary eyes, stepped forward. "Secure the perimeter," he ordered, voice low but firm. Officers fanned out, snapping photos, marking evidence, and whispering their disbelief. Few had ever seen wealth of this magnitude up close, let alone mixed with murder. In the corner of the room, half hidden behind a velvet curtain, a young woman trembled. She was barefoot, her dress torn at the strap, mascara smeared across her cheeks. Her breathing came in shallow bursts, every exhale jagged with panic. "Miss, are you hurt?" an officer asked gently. Her gaze darted from the Sheikh's body to the men in uniform. For a moment, she seemed unable to form words. Finally, a whisper escaped her lips. I tried to stop it." Her name, they would later learn, was Emily Carter, a former model who had been seen at the Sheikh's side in recent months. To the world, she was his glamorous companion. To investigators, she instantly became a person of interest. News spread quickly. Within the hour, camera crews gathered at the gates, their lenses aimed at flashing police lights. Neighbors peered from balconies, whispering about the powerful man who had lived among them. Some spoke of his generosity, his charity galas, his effortless charm. Others muttered about late-night arguments, mysterious visitors, and the unsettling way Emily always seemed on edge. Detective Harris stood over the body, frowning. "No forced entry. No signs of struggle outside this room," he muttered, scanning the gilded furniture, the overturned glass on the table. "But something's wrong here. This isn't random." His partner, Detective Ruiz, glanced toward Emily. "You think she knows more than she's saying?" Harris's eyes lingered on her trembling figure. She was here. That makes her part of this, one way or another. As paramedics confirmed death, the Sheikh's empire began to unravel in whispers. Business rivals, political connections, and hidden lovers. All possibilities, all secrets that might explain why a man of such wealth lay lifeless on a rug instead of behind the steel walls of his empire. Emily's sobs echoed faintly as officers led her into the kitchen for questioning. Her voice, fragile yet tinged with something unspoken, carried to the marble halls. "You don't understand. He wasn't who you think he was." The words hung heavy, like smoke that refused to clear. The detectives exchanged a glance. Whatever story Emily carried, it was the key to unlocking the truth about Sheikh Rashid. And as the mansion settled into silence again, the shadows seemed to close in around her, shadows that would only deepen in the days ahead. Emily Carter sat in the stark glow of the mansion's kitchen lights, her trembling hands wrapped around a glass of untouched water. Only minutes earlier, she had stood in the same spot, her cries echoing through the marble halls as officers tried to calm her. Now, silence pressing again, broken only by the steady scratching of Detective Ruiz, his pen across his notepad. To the police, she was a witness, or perhaps a suspect. To the world outside those gates, she was a mystery unraveling in real time. But to Emily herself, she was something far more fragile. A young woman who had once believed she had been saved, only to realize she had traded one prison for another. At 26, Emily's life carried scars invisible to the cameras that had once adored her. She had started modeling at 19, drawn into a world of flashing lights, promises, and betrayals. By 22, she had burned out, discarded by the same industry that once chased her. Debt followed, men followed, and loneliness, that familiar shadow, settled in like winter. Then came Rashid. She remembered their first meeting as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. He had approached her at an exclusive party in New York, his presence commanding, his smile deliberate. "You deserve more than scraps of attention," he had told her, voice like velvet dipped in power. At first, it had felt like salvation. He paid her debts, placed diamonds on her neck, and swept her into a life of luxury. Emily thought she had been chosen, rescued from obscurity. But salvation soon hardened into control. "He hated when I went out without him," she told Detective Harris in a hushed voice, eyes fixed on the tile floor. "He tracked my phone. He said it was for my safety, but..." Her voice broke, trailing into silence. Harris leaned forward slightly. "But what, Emily?" She shook her head, lips pressing shut. There was so much she wanted to say, but the weight of the words seemed dangerous, like they could seal her fate. Instead, she clutched the water glass tighter, her knuckles pale. Life in the mansion had become a gilded cage. The sprawling halls that awed visitors became corridors of isolation for Emily. Cameras lined the corners, not just for security but for surveillance. Rashid watched her movements, questioned her calls, even criticized her clothing choices when they didn't align with his taste. Every gesture reminded her that the wealth surrounding her wasn't freedom, it was ownership. And yet, she had stayed. Part of her believed she couldn't survive without him. Another part feared the consequences if she ever tried to leave. Nights often ended in arguments, his voice raised, hers swallowed by the silence of fear. But sometimes she caught glimpses of the man she had first met, charming and magnetic, whispering promises of a future together. That push and pull bound her tighter than chains. On the night of the murder, Emily's guilt and terror twisted into one. She had heard his voice, low and commanding, moments before it was silenced forever. She remembered the heavy stillness after, the kind that made her feel both liberated and doomed. As she sat across from detectives, flashes of that moment kept replaying in her mind. The fall of his body, the dark pool spreading beneath him, her own scream echoing against the walls. Was she a victim, a participant, or something in between? Her reflection caught her eye in a glass cabinet across the room, a pale face streaked with tears, hair tangled, mascara smudged. She barely recognized the woman staring back. "Emily," Ruiz said softly, breaking the quiet. "If you know something, anything, we need you to tell us." Her lips parted, but the words stuck like thorns in her throat. She wanted to confess, to release the storm building inside, but the fear of what would come next kept her silent. Instead, she whispered only, "You don't know what it was like when no one else was here." Detective Harris exchanged a look with Ruiz, the kind that spoke of both suspicion and intrigue. Emily had given them enough to dig deeper, but not enough to understand. Outside, the mansion loomed against the night sky, its windows glowing faintly. To the neighbors, it was still the palace of a billionaire. To the detectives, it was a crime scene. But to Emily, it remained what it had always been, a prison built of gold and shadows. And within those shadows, secrets waited to be uncovered. Detective Harris stood on the mansion's terrace, the cool night air brushing against his face as he watched the clusters of neighbors gathering beyond the police tape. Their hushed voices carried through the dark, thick with curiosity and fear. Emily's haunting words still echoed in his mind. "You don't know what it was like when no one else was here." And as the investigation widened, the truth about Sheikh Rashid Al-Karim began to fracture the polished image he had so carefully maintained. By day, Rashid was a man of presence. Neighbors recalled the black convoy of cars sweeping through the gated community, his immaculate suits, and the way he greeted even the most ordinary residents with a nod of regal charm. He sponsored charity luncheons, funded a new wing at the local hospital, and once paid off a struggling family's mortgage in full. He was a good man, one neighbor insisted to reporters, her voice trembling. Generous, untouchable, but behind lowered voices, a different picture emerged. Some remembered late-night shouting echoing from a mansion, muffled but sharp. Others swore they saw different women arriving at odd hours, never staying long. Always beautiful, always scared-looking. One groundskeeper whispered, and never the same girl twice. Police interviews painted a portrait of contradictions. Rashid, the philanthropist. Rashid, the tyrant. Rashid, the seducer. Inside the mansion, the detectives pressed deeper. The living room, with its glittering chandeliers and imported rugs, gave way to long hallways lined with art worth millions. Yet behind one seemingly ordinary door, officers discovered a staircase leading downward. The air was cooler there, heavy with dust and secrecy. At the bottom, they found hidden rooms. One was lined with surveillance monitors, grainy footage showing every corner of the house. Cameras had been placed not only in the hallways, but in bedrooms, the gym, even the guest bathrooms. Harris stared at the screens, unsettled. He was watching everyone, he muttered. Ruiz shook his head. Not just for security, for control. Another room revealed a collection of locked drawers. Inside were files meticulously organized, passports, photographs, contracts. Some bore the names of women linked to him in whispers. Others referenced offshore companies and accounts that suggested more than just personal indulgence. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of leather-bound journals stacked neatly on a shelf. The writing inside shifted between business notes, cryptic symbols, and chillingly intimate observations. She tried to defy me again tonight. I reminded her who owns her. The more they uncovered, the more the Sheikh's reputation unraveled. Neighbors' flashbacks contrasted sharply with these revelations. One remembered Rashid arriving at a holiday party, dazzling the room with a speech about unity and community. Another recalled him handing out expensive gifts to children on Halloween. To the public, he had been a symbol of wealth and generosity. Yet in the margins of his private world, he had constructed a kingdom of secrecy and domination. For Harris, the puzzle grew darker with each piece. If Rashid had enemies, and clearly he did, then the line between victim and perpetrator blurred. Was Emily merely a mistress caught in his web, or had she become something else entirely within the shadows of his empire? As dawn began to lighten the horizon, the mansion no longer looked like a palace. It resembled a stage where power, desire, and betrayal had collided violently. And somewhere within those hidden rooms, Harris felt certain, lay the key to the Sheikh's murder. But before investigators could connect the pieces, another voice emerged from the darkness, one that had been waiting quietly, observing everything from the edges of the Sheikh's empire. The housekeeper. The sun had barely risen when the detectives summoned the household staff into the grand dining room. The long oak table, usually adorned with silver platters and crystal glasses, now sat bare except for a line of notepads and the officers' restless pens. Among the staff, one woman kept her eyes low, her fingers clutching the rosary beads hidden inside her apron pocket. Her name was Maria Alvarez, 52 years old, the Sheikh's housekeeper for nearly 3 years. While many of the other employees came and went, Maria had stayed, silent, steady, and almost invisible. But now, she was about to step out of the shadows. Detective Harris fixed his gaze on her. Maria, you've worked here longer than anyone else. You've seen things. We need you to be honest. Maria hesitated. Loyalty had been beaten into her bones. Loyalty to her employers, to her paycheck, and above all, to her silence. But as her gaze flickered to Emily's pale figure seated at the edge of the room, she felt the weight of what she had carried for too long. I saw things, she whispered finally, her accent thick, her voice brittle. Things no one wanted to see. The room stilled. She began with the arguments. Night after night, Ray's voices cut through the marble walls. Rashid's deep, booming fury and Emily's softer, desperate replies. Sometimes glass shattered. Other times, silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Maria admitted she often pressed her ear to the kitchen door, praying the sounds would stop, praying she would not be called to clean blood from the floor. But it wasn't just Emily. There were other women. Maria continued, her hands trembling now. They came late, always at night. Sometimes one, sometimes two. They never spoke much, and they never looked me in the eye. They looked afraid. Detective Ruiz leaned forward. Did Rashid treat them the same way he treated Emily? Maria's lips pressed tight. Worse, she said at last. Some nights, I heard cries from the upstairs rooms. Not anger, not fighting. Something else. Something I cannot forget. Her words cast a chill over the room. The detective scribbled furiously, while Emily's eyes filled with silent tears. But Maria wasn't finished. She described men arriving as well, businessmen, strangers with accents from across the world. Meetings held behind locked doors, voices muffled but urgent. Sometimes Rashid's laughter followed. Sometimes only silence. Once, Maria swore she saw a man leave with his face bruised and blood on his collar. When she asked Rashid's assistant about it, she was told never to speak of it again. Her torn loyalty surfaced in every pause, every glance at Emily, every tightening grip on her rosary beads. He paid me well, Maria admitted softly. More than I ever dreamed. I sent money home to my family. I told myself not to see, not to hear. But how can you not see? Detective Harris studied her, recognizing the conflict. Maria was both complicit and courageous. Her silence a survival strategy, her words now a fragile rebellion. Maria, Harris said gently, do you believe Emily could have killed him? The question hung in the air. Maria's dark eyes flickered toward Emily again. For a moment, pity softened them. Then, something colder. I believe she had reason, she whispered. But reason is not the same as guilt. Her statement deepened the ambiguity of the case. Emily, victim or manipulator? Rashid, savior or tyrant? Maria's testimony offered no answers, only more shadows. When the questioning ended, Maria lingered in the doorway. She crossed herself quietly, her gaze sweeping once more over the walls she had polished and the floor she had scrubbed, now forever stained by secrets. She knew the mansion had not yet revealed all it held, and she was right, because as investigators combed the Sheikh's private quarters again later that day, their search uncovered disturbing evidence that pulled the case into darker waters, objects hidden in the very room where Rashid had slept, loved, and ruled. The Sheikh's private suite was unlike the rest of the mansion. While the living areas dazzled with gold leaf trim and crystal chandeliers, his bedroom was darker, heavier, a fortress within the fortress. Thick curtains blocked out daylight, the air faintly perfumed with expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke. It was here, investigators believed, that the answers lay hidden. Detective Harris moved slowly across the polished floor, careful not to disturb anything. This room isn't just for sleeping, he murmured, eyeing the custom-built wardrobes, the hidden compartments along the walls. It's a command center. Ruiz pried open a drawer in the mahogany desk. Inside lay stacks of photographs, dozens of them, women of varying ages, each captured in moments of vulnerability. Sitting by a pool, adjusting a dress strap, even sleeping. Their expressions ranged from nervous smiles to haunted stares. At the back of the stack, Harris froze. The final images were of Emily. She appeared unaware of the camera, wrapped in a towel, or standing at a window, her face vacant. These weren't taken with consent, Ruiz muttered. He was documenting them, controlling them. Next to the photographs lay folders filled with coded documents. Some referenced transactions, offshore accounts, and cryptic initials. Others listed names beside numbers that resembled payments or debts. Harris flipped through them, unease growing with every page. It was less the work of a businessman and more like ledgers of power and possession. In the corner, a cabinet revealed an even darker layer. Inside sat rows of neatly labeled hard drives, each marked by date. Officers set up a laptop, slotting one of the drives in. The screen flickered alive, displaying grainy surveillance footage from cameras embedded throughout the mansion. The images were invasive. Emily in the kitchen, laughing faintly as she poured coffee. Emily in the gym, wiping sweat from her brow. Emily in the bedroom, sitting silently on the edge of the bed, her expression hollow. Every moment of her life inside these walls had been recorded. Jesus, Ruiz whispered. He wasn't living with her. He was studying her. The footage deepened the narrative investigators were piecing together. What seemed like a glamorous affair now looked more like captivity, cloaked in luxury. Emily hadn't just been a mistress. She had been an object of surveillance, her every move tracked and archived. But there was more. One folder contained contracts, binding agreements written in cold legal language. They included clauses about confidentiality, loyalty, and financial dependency. Emily's signature was among them, shaky and inconsistent, as if written under duress. Harris's stomach twisted. He made her sign away her freedom, he said softly, as they cataloged the evidence. Emily was still in another part of the house, answering questions she barely had words for. Yet the more investigators uncovered, the less her role appeared clear. Was she a victim trapped in a carefully built cage? Or was she complicit, benefiting from his wealth while turning a blind eye to his manipulations? One officer pulled another set of photographs from beneath the mattress. These were different. Images of Emily not as a prisoner, but as someone standing over Rashid, her expression fierce, almost unrecognizable. The detectives exchanged uneasy glances. Could be staged, Harris said quickly, though doubt flickered in his tone. Or it could mean she wasn't as powerless as she claims. The room, with all its secrets, told two stories at once. One of control and surveillance, the other of possible rebellion. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred further with each discovery. As Harris packed the final folder into an evidence bag, he looked around one last time. The Sheikh's bedroom was no longer just a place of intimacy. It was a vault of manipulation, deceit, and perhaps motive. And when Emily was brought back for another round of questioning, the evidence from this very room would force her into the spotlight, push to confess, or to continue hiding behind silence. The interrogation room at the precinct was stark. A square box of pale walls, a single table, and two chairs under the hum of a fluorescent light. Emily Carter sat with her wrists resting limply on the table's edge, her skin pale against the cold metal. She looked smaller here, stripped of the mansion's opulence, her eyes swollen from sleeplessness and tears. Detective Harris and Detective Ruiz entered together, files tucked under their arms. They had spent the entire night combing through the Sheikh's private quarters, their minds filled with images of hidden cameras, contracts, and photographs. Now, face to face with Emily, they carried both suspicion and a flicker of reluctant sympathy. "Emily," Harris began, his tone calm but firm, "we've gone through his bedroom. We found surveillance footage. Hundreds of hours. All of you. We found contracts with your name. We found photographs you probably didn't even know were taken." He paused, watching her reaction. Her lips trembled. She looked down, silent. "You weren't just his mistress," Ruiz pressed. "You were his prisoner. That's what you want us to believe, isn't it?" Emily's head snapped up, tears brimming, but her voice sharp. "I didn't want to believe it. I thought he loved me." The words spilled out heavy, almost choking her. At first, it was everything. Diamonds, freedom, attention. But it was never freedom. He owned me. Every move, every breath. He wanted control. Her confession seemed to break through a dam. She sobbed, shoulders shaking, mascara bleeding into black streaks. Harris slid a box of tissues across the table. She took one, dabbing at her face, her hand trembling. Then, just as suddenly, the tears stopped. She drew in a long breath, her expression hardening like a mask being reset. She leaned back in her chair, eyes distant. The swing was jarring. Vulnerability one moment, icy silence the next. "Emily," Harris said carefully, "we need the truth about that night. Did you hurt him?" Her gaze locked on him, unblinking. Seconds stretched unbearably long before she answered. "I tried to stop it," she said finally, echoing the same words she had uttered at the crime scene. "You don't know what he was doing to me." Ruiz leaned forward. "Then tell us, what exactly did you try to stop?" But Emily said nothing more. Her lips pressed together, her eyes shifting toward the wall as though she were listening to some memory only she could hear. The detectives exchanged a look. They were caught in a loop, her words circling back to the same fragments, never enough to hold on to. Each time she cried, they almost believed her. Each time she went cold, they doubted again. Harris opened the folder in front of him and slid a photograph across the table. It was one of the images found under the Sheikh's mattress. Emily standing over Rashid, her face caught in a glare that could be interpreted as fury. "Explain this," he demanded. Emily froze, her breathing quickening. "That's not what it looks like." "Then what is it?" Ruiz asked. Her hand hovered over the photo, but didn't touch it. Her eyes welled again, but this time her voice dropped into a whisper. "He pushed me too far." The detectives leaned in, waiting for the rest, but the words never came. She shook her head violently, burying her face in her hands. "I can't," she muttered. "I can't say it." Harris exhaled slowly, frustration etched in the lines of his face. What they had was not a confession, only fragments of truth wrapped in fear and ambiguity. Enough to unsettle, but not enough to close the case. After 2 hours, the interrogation ended. Emily was led back to a holding cell, her figure shrinking beneath the harsh fluorescent light. Her half-confession lingered like smoke, impossible to pin down, poisoning every theory the detectives tried to build. Ruiz muttered as they left the room. "She's either the most broken victim I've ever seen or the best liar." Harris didn't answer. Instead, he opened another file, one detailing Rashid's business dealings. If Emily wouldn't give them clarity, perhaps Rashid's enemies would, and there were plenty of them. Detective Harris sat at his cluttered desk, staring at the growing mountain of files. Emily's half-confession still haunted him, but something about it gnawed at his instincts. She might have been complicit, but she wasn't the whole story. Rashid Al-Karim had lived too dangerously, built too much power, and stepped on too many throats for his death to be reduced to a lover's quarrel. "Look at this," Ruiz said, dropping a folder onto the desk. Inside were financial records, dozens of companies linked to Rashid's empire. Shell corporations, offshore accounts, and joint ventures with names Harris recognized from intelligence bulletins. Russian investors, Eastern European shipping firms, Middle Eastern oil partners. The guy wasn't just a billionaire playboy, Ruiz muttered. He was in deep, too deep. The deeper they dug, the darker the picture became. Rashid's American ventures, real estate, luxury imports, and high-end clubs were only the polished surface. Beneath lay trails of lawsuits, banker competitors, and whispered threats. A local contractor claimed Rashid had ruined him with one canceled deal. A rival investor swore Rashid had stolen millions through manipulation. And across the ocean, names surfaced of men whose grudges were not simply financial. One name kept repeating: Viktor Markovic, a Serbian financier with ties to organized crime. 2 years ago, Rashid had cut him out of a joint investment, walking away with profits that should have been shared. Intelligence reports suggested Markovic had vowed revenge, calling Rashid a thief dressed as a king. Then there was Khalid Al-Fahim, a fellow Gulf magnate whose family had been locked in a silent rivalry with Rashid's for decades. Their conflict had played out in business, in politics, and, rumor had it, in women. If anyone had both the money and the reason, Harris mused, it's him. But motive didn't equal opportunity. Rashid's death had been intimate, close, almost personal. If a foreign enemy had wanted him dead, why not hire professionals? Why not stage an accident or an assassination abroad? Why would they strike here, in his U.S. mansion, with Emily in the next room? Unless, Ruiz offered, that's exactly the point. Maybe they wanted it to look like her. Maybe she's just a cover. The theory held weight. But every lead twisted into contradictions. The hidden camera suggested Rashid had been paranoid, expecting betrayal from within. Yet the coded documents hinted at external threats just as dangerous. Harris knew the case was becoming a labyrinth: domestic abuse, international rivalries, business betrayals, and a mistress whose tears could be either truth or performance. Meanwhile, whispers outside the investigation grew louder. News outlets speculated wildly, portraying Rashid as both a victim of passion and a casualty of global power games. Protesters gathered outside the station, some demanding justice for Emily, others defending Rashid's reputation. The narrative fractured the city as much as it fractured the case. Back in the evidence room, Harris studied a set of bank transfers. One in particular caught his eye. $500,000 wired from Rashid's account just 3 days before his death. Destination unknown. The transaction bore only a cryptic memo line. For silence. Silence from who? Ruiz asked when Harris showed him. That's what we need to find out, Harris said. His gut told him the payment was tied directly to the events inside the mansion. Whether it bought loyalty, secrecy, or betrayal, he couldn't yet tell. By midnight, the detectives were no closer to a single narrative. Every door they opened led to more shadows. Rashid had built an empire of wealth and enemies in equal measure. And now, his death seemed less like a singular act and more like the inevitable collapse of everything he had constructed. But as the forensic reports arrived on Harris's desk the next morning, the case took another sharp turn. DNA, fingerprints, and blood evidence pointed back to one person. Not Victor, not Khalid, not shadowy rivals overseas. All trails led back to Emily Carter. The lab reports arrived in thick brown envelopes, stamped with the urgency of truth. Detective Harris ripped them open with a mixture of dread and resolve. He had sifted through endless layers of Rashid's empire, chasing rivals and shadowy enemies across continents. Yet here, in sterile printouts and grainy photographs, the case narrowed back to the very woman trembling in their custody. The evidence was brutal in its clarity. Emily Carter's fingerprints appear on the glass decanter found in the Sheikh's study, a decanter containing residue of a rare, slow-acting poison. Fibers from her robe were matched to blood on the carpet near Rashid's body. Most damning of all, a silk garment, hers, was discovered in a locked drawer of his bedroom, stained with Rashid's blood. The neatness of it was almost too perfect, as though the house itself were accusing her. Harris leaned back, rubbing his temple. It all circles back to her. Ruiz wasn't convinced, or it was staged to circle back to her. Everything about this case is too cinematic. Who hides a blood-stained dress in their own home if they're guilty? But procedure left no room for gut feeling. Emily was summoned again, her wrists cuffed, her face pale but composed. She sat across from them in the interrogation room, the fluorescent lights washing her features into something almost ghostly. Harris laid the evidence out one by one, the photos, the reports, the stained silk. Emily Carter, explain this. Explain why your fingerprints are on the poison glass. Explain why your robe is soaked in his blood. For a moment she said nothing. The silence stretched until it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Then her lips curled, not into a smile, but into something colder, a mixture of defiance and despair. "You don't know what he did to me," she whispered. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ruiz shifted uneasily. Harris pressed, his voice sharper now. "Then tell us. What did he do?" Her eyes flickered, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, gaze locked on the ceiling as though replaying a film only she could see. Tears brimmed but never fell. "People think he was a savior," Emily said at last, her voice trembling. "That he rescued me from nothing, gave me everything. But he caged me. He watched me, recorded me, owned me. I stopped being Emily. I became a possession." "Possessions don't kill their owners," Harris snapped. "They do," she replied, eyes finally meeting his, "when survival leaves no other choice." Her defense struck a nerve, not just in Harris, but in everyone who would later hear her words. Was she a murderer, cold and manipulative, covering her tracks with practiced victimhood? Or was she a survivor, pushed to the edge by a man who treated love like ownership? The paradox infuriated Harris. The evidence screamed guilt. Yet every instinct told him she wasn't lying about the abuse, about the suffocating control Rashid exerted. The question became not whether she suffered, but whether suffering justified what had happened in that mansion. When Emily was led back to her cell, Ruiz exhaled heavily. If she's guilty, it's almost too easy. If she's innocent, then someone wanted her to take the fall. Harris stared at the file, then at the photo of Rashid's lifeless body, his empire of enemies, the $500,000 transfer, the whispers of betrayal. They didn't vanish just because Emily fit the forensic puzzle. Outside, the media swarmed, amplifying every word Emily had spoken in interrogation. "You don't know what he did to me," became a headline, a rallying cry, a riddle. Public opinion split violently, some calling for her conviction, others hailing her as a woman who had struck back against tyranny behind velvet curtains. But inside the precinct, Harris's doubts only deepened. The evidence pointed at Emily Carter, yet something in his gut whispered that the truth was still buried, waiting to surface. And the next piece of evidence was already on its way, something that would upend the story again. Long before the headlines, before the blood and the flashing lights of squad cars, Emily Carter believed she had found salvation. The first flashback was like a dream, a rooftop restaurant in Dubai, gold chandeliers glinting against the city skyline. Rashid Al-Karim, draped in a suit tailored to perfection, leaned across the table, his dark eyes heavy with charm. He spoke of possibility, of freedom, of how someone like her, a struggling ex-model trying to outrun debt, deserved more. He promised the world, and for a while, he gave it. Trips to Paris, a diamond bracelet that caught every star in its reflection, cars she didn't know how to drive, mansions with doors taller than she was. Emily thought she had been chosen, loved, but love, when handed down like a prize, came with strings. At first, they were invisible threads, gentle restrictions disguised as protection. He wanted to know where she was, who she spoke to when she left the house. "Only because I worry," Rashi would say, slipping another jewel into her palm. She believed him. For months, she convinced herself that this was care, not control. The second flashback cracked the illusion. A gala in New York. Emily had laughed too freely at another man's joke. That night, back in the car, Rashid's hand gripped her wrist so tightly she thought her bones might snap. His smile never faltered as the chauffeur drove them home. "You embarrass me," he whispered, his voice like velvet stretched over steel. From then on, the gifts became apologies. The promises became warnings. Each new luxury only deepened the debt she owed him. In the mansion, Rashid installed cameras, not just for security, but for her. "So I can keep you safe," he said. Yet Emily felt his gaze even in the shower, in her sleep. Privacy no longer existed. Every movement was recorded, every expression cataloged. She stopped looking in mirrors, afraid she would see what he saw, a possession losing its shine. The humiliation escalated in whispers no one else could hear. "Without me, you're nothing. Do you think anyone would want you after this?" He never shouted. His cruelty was quiet, polished, invisible to outsiders. And when she cried, he wiped her tears with diamond-studded fingers, telling her not to be dramatic. Still, there were moments when she clung to the illusion of love. A candlelit dinner, his sudden tenderness after a storm, the way he sometimes looked at her as if she was the only person in the room. Those fragments kept her tethered, even as the chain cut deeper. But tethering is not the same as loving. By the final months, Emily no longer recognized herself. Her friends' calls went unanswered. Her modeling contacts gave up. She lived in a golden prison, silenced by fear, smothered by opulence. The breaking point came one evening in his private quarters. Rashid returned late, smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. When Emily dared to question him, his laughter was sharp enough to wound. "You forget your place. You are not my equal. You are my shadow." Her silence that night was not submission. It was a beginning of resolve. A seed of rebellion took root, though she did not yet know what shape it would grow into. Back in the interrogation room weeks later, her whispered offense echoed with new clarity. "You don't know what he did to me." It wasn't just a plea. It was a truth carved into her skin by years of luxury turned to shackles, promises twisted into chains. For investigators, the flashbacks painted motive. For Emily, they painted survival. And as Harris pored over her testimony, he realized the case was no longer only about murder. It was about the thin, trembling line between love and control, and what happens when that line snaps. The next revelation, however, would not come from Emily at all. It would come from someone who had been watching from the edges all along. The marble pillars of the courthouse rose like silent sentinels, holding the weight of every secret that was about to be exposed. By the time Emily Carter was escorted inside, cameras flashed with merciless hunger, reporters jostling for a glimpse of the woman who had transformed from mistress to murder suspect, from victim to potential villain. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The prosecution laid their case with clinical precision. The fingerprints, the poison residue, the blood-stained garment. To them, Emily was not a survivor, but a calculating manipulator who had tired her gilded cage and decided to free herself the only way she could, by killing Rashid Al-Karim. Her lawyer countered with a very different picture. Emily, they argued, was not a schemer but a prisoner in a mansion of wealth and cruelty. They painted Rashid as a man whose charm concealed an empire of abuse and humiliation, who reduced Emily to a possession and watched her every move. When the defense invoked her chilling words, "You don't know what he did to me," the gallery rippled with unease. The trial became less about evidence and more about perception. Was Emily a victim pushed past her breaking point, or a femme fatale spinning tragedy into excuse? Each testimony became another blade twisting deeper into the uncertainty. Maria, the housekeeper, took the stand with trembling hands. She spoke of late-night arguments echoing through the halls, of Emily's tear-streaked face glimpsed in the morning, of Rashid's temper when things were not as he demanded. Yet, under cross-examination, Maria faltered. "Did you ever see him strike her?" the prosecutor pressed. Maria hesitated. "No," she admitted softly, "but I saw fear in her eyes." The courtroom fractured along those lines. Fear versus fact, perception versus proof. Some jurors leaned forward with sympathy. Others leaned back with suspicion. Then came the forensic expert. He described in painstaking detail how the poison was found, how Emily's fingerprints clung to the decanter. This was not an accident, he declared. It was deliberate, intimate, planned. His certainty cast a shadow across the defense's narrative. But Emily's lawyer struck back with psychological testimony. A specialist explained the nature of coercive control, the invisible chains of manipulation, the way an abuser could strip someone of agency until even drastic actions became survival. The words "battered woman syndrome" were whispered, debated, dissected. Through it all, Emily sat in silence, her posture taut, her face unreadable. Sometimes she appeared broken, her eyes glistening with grief. Other times, she seemed cold, detached, a woman watching the world from behind glass. Her shifting demeanor only deepened the mystery. Outside, the media frenzy raged. Headlines clashed. Cold-blooded mistress versus prisoner in silk. Public opinion divided sharply, each faction convinced of its truth. Protesters held signs calling her a liar. Others raised banners demanding justice for women trapped in invisible prisons. The trial was no longer about one man's death, but about the cost of power, love, and control. On the final day of testimony, the prosecution delivered its blow, the $500,000 transfer Rashid had made before his death. For silence, the memo read. Silence from whom? The prosecutor thundered. He argued that Emily had demanded it, that greed and desperation had fueled her hand. The defense countered with equal ferocity, suggesting Rashid himself had been silencing someone else, another secret, another enemy, that Emily had become the scapegoat for forces far greater than her. By the time closing arguments ended, the jury's faces were masks of exhaustion. The judge's gavel fell, dismissing them to deliberate. Emily was led away in cuffs once more, her eyes scanning the gallery. For a moment, she looked directly at Detective Harris, who had testified earlier about the evidence trail. Her gaze held his, sharp as glass, as if daring him to decide what story he believed. When the courtroom emptied, Harris lingered by the wooden benches, his thoughts unsettled. The case felt less like justice and more like theater, truth slipping through the cracks of performance and perception. And as the jury retreated behind closed doors, the fate of Emily Carter and the hidden legacy of Rashid Al-Karim hung in a silence heavier than any verdict yet spoken. The jury had not yet returned when Detective Harris received the call. A team cataloging the Sheikh's belongings had unearthed something hidden deep within the mansion's east wing. Harris left the courthouse at once, a storm of unease following him back to the scene where it all began. In the Sheikh's private study, officers stood before a false wall pried open to reveal rows of black shelves. On them, hundreds of neatly labeled tapes and hard drives. The evidence technician's gloved hands trembled as he handed Harris one of the cases. The label was simple: Emily, bedroom, June 3rd. Harris felt the air tighten around him. Rashid hadn't just installed cameras for security. He had turned his home into a theater of surveillance. Every hallway, every room, every private moment had been captured. The mansion wasn't just a home. It was a stage where Rashid played director, and his guests, his lovers, his servants, every one of them, were unwilling actors. The first tape they played confirmed what Harris feared. Grainy black and white footage of Emily sitting on the edge of her bed, sobbing into her hands, while Rashid's voice thundered from off-screen. His words were cruel, laced with venomous control. "You are mine, Emily. Don't ever forget that. Without me, you are nothing." The next tape was worse. A series of confrontations. Rashid belittling her, threatening her, laughing when she tried to leave. The evidence of psychological abuse was undeniable. Emily had been telling the truth. Rashid's charm in public was only a mask. Behind closed doors, he was a predator. But then came the tape that shifted everything. Labeled Study, September 14th. The footage showed Emily alone, standing at the bar, carefully pouring liquid from a small vial into Rashid's glass decanter. Her hands shook, but she finished, wiping the rim before placing it back. Hours later, Rashid entered the room, poured himself a drink, and raised it to his lips. The room fell silent as the footage ended. That was undeniable proof. Emily had poisoned him. Yet, even in the face of this revelation, nothing was simple. The recordings also contained other horrors: women pleading with Rashid, servants trembling under his threats, documents suggesting financial blackmail and extortion. Rashid had been both king and tyrant in his mansion of shadows. When Harris returned to the courthouse with the tapes, the trial shifted violently. The prosecution seized on the September 14th recording, playing for the jury like the final nail in Emily's coffin. This is no accident, no mistake. This is intent, the prosecutor declared, his voice cutting through the silence. The defense, however, leaned on the other recordings, building a damning portrait of Rashid's cruelty. Yes, she poured the poison, Emily's lawyer admitted. But after years of control, surveillance, and psychological torment, she was not living. She was surviving. That house was her prison, and Rashid was her jailer. Tell me, was this murder or was it escape? The jury listened, their expressions unreadable. The judge instructed them to weigh intent, evidence, and circumstance. Outside, crowds swelled, half chanting for conviction, half crying out in Emily's defense. And Emily herself? She sat motionless, her face pale but unreadable as the footage replayed again and again. In her silence, people projected their own truths. Some saw a cold calculation. Others saw a broken woman finally striking back. The tapes had revealed everything, yet answered nothing. Rashid was both victim and villain. Emily was both prisoner and perpetrator. The lines blurred until even Harris, hardened by years of cases, no longer knew what justice looked like. As the gavel struck and the jury withdrew for their final deliberations, the weight of the tapes lingered like a storm no verdict could dispel. Justice was no longer a question of guilt or innocence. It was a mirror held up to human darkness, reflecting truths too tangled to untangle. And when the story closed, one question remained, echoing louder than any judgment. Did Emily kill a monster, or did she become one herself?